The village constable, young Sergeant Willis, arrived within 20 minutes, his bicycle leaning against the manor gates with a sort of haphazard urgency that suggested he had pedaled faster than his training had prepared him for. Dr. Havers had already examined the body. Edward Fairfax lay slumped in a wing-back chair in the library, his face a ghastly shade of purple, his breathing entirely ceased. The doctor's preliminary assessment, delivered in low tones to the sergeant, suggested poison. The faint almond scent that lingered about the deceased's lips was unmistakable to anyone with medical knowledge, though Sergeant Willis seemed to notice it only when Dr. Havers specifically mentioned it. By 4:30, the news had spread through Little Brackham with the efficiency of wildfire through dry timber. Mrs. Penrose's grocer boy had been found standing in the doorway of Blackthorn Manor, and within minutes every telephone line in the village hummed with whispered speculation. By tea time, the accepted narrative had solidified. Edward Fairfax, the mysterious newcomer, had taken his own life. The motive was not immediately clear. Gambling debts, perhaps, or some romantic entanglement, but his outsider status made his self-destruction seem somehow inevitable, as though the village had unconsciously expected such drama from a man who had arrived with so little explanation. Miss Marple, having excused herself from the fete with gracious brevity, made her way home to her cottage in the gathering dusk. Her small sitting room, with its familiar arrangement of antimacassars and porcelain figurines, welcomed her with the comfort of the perpetually ordinary. Yet she did not settle into her usual chair as one might expect. Instead, she retrieved her small writing desk and withdrew a sheet of correspondence paper, upon which she began to write brief notes, each one capturing a particular observation from the afternoon's events. The constable, meanwhile, was conducting what he believed to be a thorough investigation. Sergeant Willis was a well-meaning young man, not yet 30, whose experience with serious crime extended only to the occasional poaching incident or the theft of church silver that had turned out to be a misunderstanding involving the vicar's absent-minded wife. He approached the case with the methodical reasoning of a man who had read police procedure manuals, but rarely encountered genuine mystery. The body was removed to the hospital in the neighboring town. The library at Blackthorn Manor was secured, though Willis's definition of security amounted to locking the door and posting a notice. The contents of Mr. Fairfax's rooms were not thoroughly catalogued, merely glanced at and deemed unremarkable. His desk held letters from a solicitor regarding the lease agreement, and nothing more suspicious than a half-finished game of solitaire. His wardrobe suggested a man of moderate means. His personal effects revealed no diary, no correspondences of an intimate nature, nothing that might illuminate his reasons for self-termination. Yet there were certain details that troubled the orderly narrative that Willis had begun to construct. The glass from which Fairfax had supposedly drunk the poison was not found in the library. His hands, though lifeless, showed no signs of the convulsions that typically accompanied cyanide poisoning. And most peculiarly, his shoes, well-polished Italian leather, bore fresh mud on their soles, the sort of reddish clay that was characteristic of the footpath leading away from the manor toward the village proper, not the grounds surrounding the house itself. On the following morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the vicar's wife, Mrs. Catherine Milton, a woman of nervous disposition who had lived in Little Brackham for only 5 years. The two women sat in Mrs. Milton's sun-drenched parlour, a room filled with the sort of modern furnishings that suggested a woman trying very deliberately to appear contemporary. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Milton murmured, her teacup rattling slightly against its saucer. "Though I confess I never truly understood Mr. Fairfax. He seemed pleasant enough, but there was something rather distant about him, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Tell me, dear, had you observed him much in his time here? Did he seem a man of settled habits?" "Oh, well, my husband mentioned seeing him at the public house on several occasions," Mrs. Milton said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Talking quite seriously with Colonel Ashford, I'm told. And once I'm almost certain I saw him speaking rather animatedly with that Penrose woman. You know, the widow who manages the bookshop." "Mrs. Diana Penrose?" Miss Marple inquired, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Yes, though I hardly like to speak ill. She's respectable enough, I suppose, but there's something rather independent about her. The sort of woman who doesn't seem entirely bound by the usual conventions." Miss Marple thanked her hostess warmly and departed shortly thereafter. As she walked through the village toward her cottage, she found herself retracing the path from Blackthorn Manor, noting the peculiar quality of the clay underfoot, the proximity of Eleanor Carster's house to the woodland route, and the curious fact that the new post office delivery route ran directly past the manor's eastern boundary. By evening, Miss Marple had compiled a series of observations that suggested the accepted narrative was not merely incomplete, but fundamentally incorrect. Edward Fairfax had not taken his own life. He had been murdered, and the killer, she suspected, was someone far more familiar to the village than anyone had yet considered. The true investigation, she realized, was only just beginning. The inquest was scheduled for Wednesday morning, a full 3 days after Mr. Fairfax's discovery. In the intervening time, Little Brackham had settled into that peculiar state of village excitement mixed with theatrical mourning that seemed to characterize such events. The magistrate, Mr. Hartley, had already begun to formalize the verdict in his mind. Suicide while temporarily insane. It was a convenient conclusion, one that required minimal further investigation and allowed the village to return to its comfortable routines with the sort of philosophical resignation that comes from accepting the inexplicable. It was on the Tuesday evening before the inquest that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Diana Penrose, the widow who managed the village bookshop, arrived at the cottage door with her usual directness, her dark hair pulled severely back, her manner suggesting a woman accustomed to making her own decisions and bearing her own consequences. She was perhaps 45, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed with scientific precision. "I hope I'm not intruding," Diana said, though her tone suggested she cared little whether she was or not. "I wanted to speak with you before the inquest. I have the impression, Miss Marple, that you are a woman who notices things that others might miss." Miss Marple gestured for her guest to sit, offering tea with that particular grace that made even unexpected callers feel they had been anticipated. "I spend rather a great deal of time noticing things, Mrs. Penrose. It's one of the compensations of advancing age. One becomes invisible and therefore observant." Diana accepted the tea but held the cup without drinking, her fingers drumming against its rim in a manner that betrayed her agitation. "I knew Edward Fairfax before he came to Little Brackham. Not well, you understand, but sufficiently to know that he was not a man inclined towards self-destruction. He had, in fact, recently acquired a considerable sum of money through inheritance. He was planning to establish himself here more permanently, perhaps even to consider marriage." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her expression remaining pleasantly neutral. And yet the constable found no letters, no documentation of these plans. "Precisely." Diana leaned forward, her intensity increasing, which suggests that someone who knew of his plans took extraordinary care to erase them. Mr. Fairfax kept meticulous records of his finances. He was, I believe, the sort of man who would have documented his intentions in writing. Miss Marple poured more tea with unhurried precision. "I understand you were seen speaking with him quite recently. The day of the fête, perhaps?" Diana's expression shifted, not with guilt, precisely, but with the recognition that her movements had been observed and noted. "Yes, he came to the bookshop on Saturday morning. He seemed troubled, distracted. He asked me whether I thought it was possible for a man to repair his reputation in a small village, whether such places were genuinely capable of forgiving past transgressions. I told him that villages remember everything, but that perhaps that wasn't entirely unfortunate." "How philosophically put," Miss Marple observed. "And what sort of transgressions did you understand him to be referring to?" "He didn't specify," Diana admitted, "but I gathered it had something to do with his past business dealings. He mentioned having made certain financial adjustments that had seemed justified at the time but now troubled his conscience." After Diana's departure, Miss Marple sat in her parlour long into the evening, her knitting needles clicking with mechanical regularity, while her mind worked through the architecture of motive and opportunity that the case presented. By the time the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11, she had begun to perceive the outlines of something far more complex than a simple poisoning. On Wednesday morning, the inquest proceeded with the formal machinery of English justice moving at its customary glacial pace. Dr. Havers testified to the presence of cyanide in the deceased's system. Sergeant Willis presented his findings, or rather, the absence of findings, with apologetic thoroughness. Thomas Brackley gave his account of discovering the body with admirable composure for someone of his youth. The conclusion seemed inevitable, predetermined, almost ceremonial in its predictability. Yet it was during the magistrate's summary that Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the back of the courtroom, observed something that caused her to set down her handkerchief with particular deliberation. Eleanor Carstairs, seated in the third row, had reached up to touch the small brooch at her throat, a gesture of such profound relief that it could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was: the relaxation of someone who had been experiencing considerable strain and who now believed that strain to be lifting. That evening, Miss Marple made her way to the public house, where village gossip accumulated like sediment in a river. She ordered a small sherry and positioned herself near enough to hear the conversations of the men gathered about the bar. It was here that she learned of the old debt, the one that had existed between Colonel Ashford and Edward Fairfax many years prior, before Fairfax had come to Little Brackham. It was here that she learned of the letter that had arrived at the manor some 3 weeks ago, a letter that had caused Fairfax considerable distress, and it was here, most crucially, that she learned the name of the person who had delivered that letter to Blackthorn Manor. It had been Eleanor Carstairs, on her weekly walk to the manor to discuss the arrangement of flowers for the church. The following morning, Miss Marple took a deliberate walk past Eleanor Carstairs' house, that neat Victorian villa, with its geometrically perfect gardens and curtains, always drawn to precisely the correct angle. She had known Eleanor for some 20 years, had watched her move through the village with the sort of purposeful efficiency that suggested a woman who believed that proper organization could forestall any chaos the universe might devise. Yet efficiency, Miss Marple had observed throughout her long life, was often merely the disguise that control wore. At the vicar's house, she found Mrs. Milton in the garden, pruning roses with aggressive precision that seemed at odds with her usually nervous demeanor. The conversation, when it came, was oblique, the sort of exchange that appeared to concern nothing of consequence while actually addressing matters of considerable importance. "I was wondering, dear," Miss Marple began, settling herself on a garden bench with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones required such consideration, "about the church flower arrangements. Eleanor has been managing them for how long now?" Mrs. Milton paused, her pruning shears suspended mid-action. "Oh, for years, since long before I arrived in the village. She's terribly particular about it all. The flowers must be exactly right, positioned at precisely the correct angles. The vicar jokes that Eleanor's arrangements are more mathematically perfect than spiritually inspired. And yet she must have considerable access to the manor houses and important residences, delivering flowers, arranging things." Miss Marple's tone was perfectly casual, that of an elderly woman making idle conversation. "Well, yes, I suppose. Eleanor takes her responsibilities quite seriously. She considers herself something of a custodian of village aesthetics, I think. She even manages the flowers at Blackthorn Manor, or she did. Mr. Fairfax was rather particular about his arrangements too, though in a completely different way from Eleanor. He preferred wild things, orchids, unusual specimens. Eleanor found it rather difficult to work with, I imagine." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and shortly thereafter took her leave. That afternoon, She made an appointment to visit the doctor's office under the pretext of having her blood pressure examined, a condition that required no actual examination but served as a useful cover for conversation. Dr. Havers, a man of some 70 years who had practiced in Little Brackham for nearly 4 decades, was always willing to discuss his observations of village life in the guarded manner of someone bound by professional confidence, yet desperate for intellectual engagement. "I was curious about Mr. Fairfax," Miss Marple mentioned as the doctor released the pressure cuff from her arm. "He seemed a rather troubled gentleman, didn't he? I wonder whether he had consulted with you about his health at any point." Dr. Havers settled back into his chair, considering the question with professional deliberation. "Actually, he did come to see me, about 6 weeks ago, complaining of headaches, insomnia, general malaise. I prescribed nothing of consequence. Rest, exercise, a reduction in whatever was troubling him. He seemed to be under considerable strain, though he was reticent about its source." "And did he mention anything specific? Any correspondence or unexpected visitors that might have occasioned his distress?" The doctor's expression became more guarded. "He did mention receiving some correspondence that had disturbed him. He said it concerned a matter from his past, something he had believed settled but which apparently was not. He asked whether I thought people could truly start fresh in small communities. I told him what I've learned to be true, that small villages have long memories, but occasionally, just occasionally, they also have mercy." By evening, Miss Marple had arranged to take tea with Colonel Ashford, a man she had known for many years and whose habits were as regular as the tide. The colonel lived with his second wife, Marjorie, a woman some 30 years his junior, whose beauty had begun to fade slightly at the edges, worn away by the constant anxiety of maintaining both her appearance and her position in a village that had never truly welcomed her. "I wanted to ask you about an old matter," Miss Marple said as they settled into the colonel's comfortable study. "Something concerning Mr. Fairfax? I believe you may have known him many years ago?" The colonel's face underwent a subtle transformation, the comfortable bonhomie of social interaction replaced by something harder, more guarded. "That was a very long time ago, Miss Marple. Ancient history, best left buried." "And yet history has a way of refusing to remain buried," Miss Marple observed gently, "particularly when someone believes they have unfinished business." The colonel rose and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of rigid control. "There was a matter of money, a business arrangement that went rather badly. Fairfax and I were younger then, less wise perhaps. When he left the area, I believed the matter concluded. But 3 weeks ago, I received a letter suggesting that it was not. The letter was accompanied by documentation that implied certain improprieties on my part. I was being asked to provide financial recompense. And who delivered this letter? Eleanor Carstairs. She said she was simply doing an errand, passing it along as a courtesy. But I wondered afterward how she had come to possess it, how she had known of the arrangement between myself and Fairfax, how she could have possibly understood its significance. Miss Marple allowed the weight of this revelation to settle into the room like dust after an upheaval. By the time she departed Colonel Ashford's house, the threads that had seemed so disparate were beginning to weave themselves into a pattern, one that suggested Eleanor Carstairs had possessed far more knowledge of Edward Fairfax's past than anyone had previously realized. More importantly, she possessed a motive that went beyond simple malice into something far more complex. The motive of someone whose own carefully constructed life was threatened by revelation. Thursday morning arrived with the sort of grey English drizzle that seemed to seep into one's bones and settle there with permanent intention. Miss Marple spent the early hours in her study, arranging her notes with the methodical precision that belied her elderly appearance. Each observation had been recorded, each conversation catalogued, each inconsistency noted. The pattern was becoming clearer, though there remained certain gaps that required deliberate investigation. She needed to understand not merely who had killed Edward Fairfax, but precisely how Eleanor Carstairs had accomplished it with such apparent ease, and more crucially, why the village had been so willing to accept the convenient fiction of suicide. It was at 10:30 that Sergeant Willis appeared at Miss Marple's cottage door, his uniform somewhat dampened by the persistent rain, his expression suggesting a man confronting thoughts that had begun to trouble his previously settled conclusions. He held a small envelope in his hand, clutching it with the carefulness of someone who had suddenly realized that evidence might not always speak for itself. "Miss Marple," he began, his youthful face flushed with the embarrassment of uncertainty, "I wonder if I might impose upon your time. A matter has come to my attention, and I find myself rather uncertain how to proceed." Miss Marple invited him into her sitting room with the grace of someone entirely unsurprised by his arrival. She had, in fact, been expecting him for the better part of the morning, had set out the good china, and prepared tea with the knowledge that this conversation would require both comfort and clarity. "What is it that troubles you, Sergeant?" she asked, settling herself with her knitting needles as though his presence were perfectly ordinary. Willis opened the envelope carefully, producing a small glass vial filled with what appeared to be white powder. "This was found this morning during a more thorough examination of Mr. Fairfax's study, an examination I should have conducted immediately, but which I postponed in the belief that the matter was already concluded. It was hidden beneath a loose floorboard near his desk, wrapped in this note." He produced a second paper, upon which was written in a trembling hand, "For Eleanor, as discussed. Payment for services rendered, E.F." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate slowness, allowing the weight of this discovery to settle between them. "Cyanide, I presume. And yet the presence of this vial raises certain questions, doesn't it, Sergeant? Questions about timing, about preparation, about precisely how and when this poison entered Mr. Fairfax's body." "That's precisely what troubles me," Willis admitted, his voice taking on the quality of a man thinking aloud. "The doctor's examination suggested the poison was ingested, likely through food or drink. Yet there was no glass in the library, no plate, no evidence of consumption. And this vial, why would a man who had procured poison secretly also leave evidence of his intention behind?" "Perhaps because he didn't intend to use it at all," Miss Marple suggested quietly. "Perhaps the poison was acquired for an entirely different purpose, and its presence in his study was meant to suggest something entirely different to someone who came looking for it." Willis absorbed this observation with the dawning comprehension of someone watching a familiar landscape suddenly reorganize itself into unfamiliar terrain. "You think someone else used the poison, someone who knew it was there?" "I think it possible," Miss Marple said, "that Eleanor Carstairs knew of this vial's existence. I think it possible that she had, in fact, encouraged its acquisition. And I think it highly probable that she used Mr. Fairfax's own poison against him, then carefully arranged circumstances to suggest that he had taken his own life. But how? How could she have administered the poison without being observed? How could she have ensured that he would ingest it?" Miss Marple rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age and walked to her kitchen, retrieving from a shelf a small ceramic jar containing what appeared to be flour, or some similar innocuous substance. "Tell me, Sergeant, what did Eleanor Carstairs bring to the summer fete? What refreshment did she specifically prepare?" Willis's face underwent a transformation as memory aligned with horrified comprehension. "The apricot tarts. She made the apricot tarts, and she was quite insistent that Mr. Fairfax should try one. She sent young Thomas around to the manor that very afternoon with a special delivery as a gesture of village welcome. And yet those tarts were remarkably fresh," Miss Marple continued, "baked that very morning, fresh enough that they should have retained considerable warmth and moisture for several hours. And yet when I observed them at the fete, they had cooled with unusual rapidity. The glaze was dull, the structure compromised. Do you know why, Sergeant?" Willis shook his head, his entire understanding of the crime beginning to crumble and rebuild itself on new foundations. Because Eleanor had laced the pastry filling with a substance designed to accelerate the cooling process and mask the presence of the poison. She would have known that Mr. Fairfax, being a man of somewhat isolated habits, would consume whatever refreshment was delivered to him with minimal hesitation. She would have known that by evening the poison would have taken full effect, and that the presence of the empty vial in his study would suggest to a cursory investigator that he had deliberately poisoned himself. "But why?" Willis asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Why would Eleanor Carstairs commit murder?" "Because," Miss Marple said, returning to her seat with the weight of terrible knowledge, "Edward Fairfax possessed information about Eleanor's past that threatened to destroy everything she had constructed in this village. He knew secrets that she could not afford to have revealed, and she was a woman for whom control and reputation were everything." Willis sat in stunned silence, the complexity of human motivation overwhelming the simple narrative he had constructed. Outside, the rain continued its patient work of erosion, wearing away at the certainties of the village, revealing the dark soil beneath. By the time Sergeant Willis departed from Miss Marple's cottage, the rain had intensified into something more substantial, transforming the village streets into rivers of grey water that reflected the overcast sky with depressing accuracy. Willis carried with him the small vial and the damning note, along with a burden of knowledge that seemed to press upon his shoulders with physical weight. He would need to present this evidence to his superiors, to initiate a formal investigation that would extend beyond the comfortable boundaries of village gossip into the territories of legal consequence. Yet before official machinery could be set in motion, there remained a matter that Miss Marple felt obligated to address with Eleanor Carstairs directly. It was not a question of justice. That would be served well enough by the constabulary and the courts. It was rather a question of understanding, of comprehending precisely how a woman of Eleanor's intelligence and capability had allowed herself to descend into murderous desperation. Miss Marple had learned throughout her long life that human nature rarely presented itself in simple absolutes, and that even the most heinous acts were often accompanied by circumstances and compulsions that deserved acknowledgement, if not forgiveness. The following morning, having received a polite but insistent invitation through the post, Eleanor Carstairs presented herself at Miss Marple's cottage at precisely 10 o'clock. She was dressed in her usual impeccable manner, her grey hair arranged with geometric precision, her face composed into an expression of social pleasantness that barely concealed the tension beneath. She carried herself with the particular rigidity of someone whose entire being had been organized around the maintenance of control, and for whom loss of that control represented a kind of death. "I understand that certain matters have come to light," Eleanor said without preamble, settling herself in the offered chair with the stiffness of someone unaccustomed to genuine relaxation. "Matters concerning the unfortunate death of Mr. Fairfax?" "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed, pouring tea with her usual unhurried grace. "The constable has been rather thorough in his revised investigation. He discovered the vial of cyanide, the note suggesting payment for services. The laboratory analysis of the apricot tarts will, I suspect, confirm traces of both poison and an adulterant designed to mask its presence." Eleanor's cup rattled slightly as she raised it to her lips. "I suppose you believe you have unraveled the entire matter, Miss Marple? That you have determined my guilt with that particular certainty that seems to be your specialty?" "I have made certain observations," Miss Marple replied carefully, "and have drawn conclusions that seem reasonable given the available evidence. But I confess I remain curious about the particulars, about why you felt compelled to commit such an act. You are not by nature a woman of impulsive violence. This required planning, deliberation, considerable risk." Eleanor set down her cup with controlled precision. For a long moment she said nothing, her fingers drumming against the arm of her chair in a rhythm that suggested internal debate of considerable intensity. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual certainty, becoming instead something fractured and vulnerable. "You knew Reverend Carstairs, didn't you, Miss Marple?" My late husband. Of course, a good man from all accounts, though I confess I always sensed a certain unhappiness in your marriage, an emotional distance that seemed peculiar in a man of the cloth. He was a coward, Eleanor said flatly. A man who preached virtue from his pulpit while engaging in the most contemptible deceptions in private. 20 years ago, before we came to Little Brackham, Edward Fairfax was my husband's lover. They had a relationship that extended over several years until Edward finally left the area to escape the complications and the scandal that threatened to expose them both. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation without visible reaction, though her understanding of the crime underwent a subtle shift, acquiring new dimensions and depths. My husband came to Little Brackham to escape that past, Eleanor continued, her voice becoming harder. He became a man of exemplary piety, a devoted servant of the church. No one here knew about his previous life. No one suspected. When he died 5 years ago, he was mourned as a man of genuine spiritual dedication. I've spent every day since protecting that reputation, maintaining the fiction that he was exactly what he pretended to be. And then Edward Fairfax arrived in the village, Miss Marple said softly. He arrived with his inheritance, with his newfound respectability, with his apparent desire to settle here and establish himself. He came to me within days of his arrival and told me that he intended to write a memoir, that he intended to document his life honestly, including his relationship with my husband. He said he owed it to himself and to history to cease living a lie. He said he was prepared for scandal, prepared for judgment, but that he would no longer participate in the deception. Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble, the careful control she had maintained cracking like porcelain under pressure. My entire life has been constructed upon protecting my husband's memory. My position in this village, my respectability, my purpose, all of it has depended upon maintaining the fiction that he was a good man. And Fairfax was prepared to destroy that with his memoir, to expose my husband as a hypocrite, to make me a figure of pity and ridicule. "So you killed him," Miss Marple said, not as accusation, but as simple statement of fact. "I poisoned him," Eleanor corrected, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Using poison that he himself had acquired, having confessed to me that he sometimes considered ending his own life if his past became public knowledge. I simply accelerated the inevitable, made certain that his own demons consumed him. I did what was necessary to protect the life I had built, the reputation I had defended, the memory of my husband that has been my only source of dignity for 5 years. Miss Marple regarded this woman, this careful, controlled, desperate woman, with an expression of profound sadness. "And was it worth it, Eleanor? Now that it is all unraveling regardless?" Eleanor did not answer. She simply rose from her chair and walked toward the window, staring out at the rain-soaked village with the gaze of someone watching the final dissolution of everything she had sacrificed so much to maintain. The constable arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within the hour, summoned by a telephone call that Miss Marple had made with quiet efficiency once Eleanor had departed. Eleanor had not attempted to flee, had not protested or resisted. She had simply gathered her coat and gloves with the same geometric precision she applied to all her actions, and had allowed herself to be escorted from the village by Sergeant Willis with the resigned composure of someone accepting an inevitable conclusion. By midday, the news had begun to spread through Little Brackham with the force of a revelation, though it moved through the village with a peculiar quality, not the excitement that typically accompanied scandal, but rather a kind of stunned disbelief, as though the very foundations of understanding had shifted beneath everyone's feet. Eleanor Carstairs, the woman who had represented order and respectability, who had organized church flowers with mathematical precision and maintained her cottage gardens as though they were museums of perfection, had murdered a man. Worse, she had done so to protect a secret that now seemed simultaneously profound and utterly trivial. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Milton, spent the afternoon in a state of considerable distress, calling upon various neighbors to process the shocking revelation. The doctor's wife announced that she had always suspected Eleanor of harboring secrets, a claim that seemed somewhat dubious given her previous wholehearted acceptance of Eleanor's social authority. Colonel Ashford retreated into his study, his relief at not being implicated in murder apparently outweighed by his discomfort at the truth of his old friend's hidden life being exposed so publicly. Diana Penrose, when told of Eleanor's confession, displayed a reaction quite different from that of most of the village. She appeared at Miss Marple's cottage in the late afternoon, her expression combining sympathy with something approaching vindication. "I suspected something was terribly wrong," Diana said, accepting the offered tea without the nervous hesitation that characterized most village interactions. "Edward mentioned to me that Eleanor had been behaving strangely since his arrival, asking pointed questions about his intentions, his plans, his reasons for choosing to settle in Little Brackham. He said she seemed almost frightened of him, though he couldn't understand why." "She was frightened," Miss Marple confirmed, "though not of Mr. Fairfax himself. She was frightened of exposure, of having her carefully constructed life dismantled by someone who possessed knowledge of secrets she had spent years protecting. It is a particular species of fear, Mrs. Penrose, the fear not of physical harm but of social annihilation. And yet she committed murder to prevent that exposure," Diana observed, "which seems to me a rather ironic miscalculation. By killing Fairfax, she guaranteed the very scandal she was attempting to prevent." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect Eleanor was not thinking rationally by that point. She was operating from a place of desperation so profound that it overrode her considerable intelligence. She allowed her fear to consume her judgment, and in doing so, she destroyed not merely Edward Fairfax, but herself as well." The formal proceedings began the following week. Eleanor was transferred to a larger police station in the neighboring county town, where more serious crimes were typically investigated. The magistrate's preliminary hearing revealed the full extent of the evidence against her: the poisoned tarts, the adulterant designed to mask the poison's presence, the note written in Eleanor's own hand requesting payment for services rendered. The case, once submitted for trial, seemed entirely straightforward to the legal professionals involved. Yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by aspects of the affair that the law seemed insufficient to address. She spent considerable time reflecting upon the nature of Eleanor's crime, upon the circumstances that had driven an intelligent woman to such desperation, upon the hidden lives that so many people in the village had been conducting beneath the surface of their public personas. It was this reflection that prompted her to visit the church one afternoon, finding the new temporary vicar, a young man of perhaps 30, arranging flowers with somewhat less geometric precision than Eleanor had favored. She sat in the quiet sanctuary, surrounded by the accumulated weight of years of worship and prayer, and found herself contemplating the particular cruelty of secrets, the way they metastasized beneath the surface of propriety and eventually poisoned everything they touched. That evening, Miss Marple received a letter from Eleanor, forwarded through the police and bearing all the stamps of official correspondence. The handwriting was still precise, still controlled, though now it wavered slightly, as though the hand writing it had begun to lose its certainty. Eleanor wrote of her regret, not for the murder itself, but for her failure to prevent it. She wrote of her realization that in attempting to protect her husband's memory, she had sacrificed her own soul. She wrote of understanding, too late, that secrets were never truly secrets, that they merely accumulated interest over time until they became too heavy to bear. The letter concluded with a single sentence that struck Miss Marple with particular force. "I wonder if anyone in this village truly knows who they are, or if we are all simply performing the roles we have invented for ourselves, terrified of being seen." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her correspondence drawer alongside the other documents and observations she'd accumulated throughout her investigation. She thought of Eleanor Carstairs, sitting in a cell awaiting trial, her perfect order finally shattered. She thought of Reverend Carstairs, dead 5 years, but still exerting his malign influence through the secrets he had left behind. She thought of Edward Fairfax, whose only crime had been a desire for authenticity in a village that had built itself upon carefully maintained fictions. And she thought, as she had thought so many times throughout her long life, of the terrible vulnerability of human nature, the way that love and fear and the desperate need to maintain control could transform ordinary people into capable of extraordinary violence. The trial commenced on a cold November morning, 3 months after Edward Fairfax's death had disrupted the comfortable rhythms of Little Brackham. The courthouse in the county town was a Victorian structure of considerable dignity, all dark wood and high ceilings designed to inspire both respect for the law and a certain nervous deference in those who found themselves within its confines. Eleanor Carstairs arrived in a police van, her appearance having undergone a subtle transformation during her imprisonment. Her hair, always so meticulously arranged, now showed threads of grey that had previously been carefully concealed. Her clothing, though still neat, lacked the geometric precision that had characterized her every public appearance. She seemed to have diminished somehow, as though incarceration had extracted something essential from her being. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. The forensic evidence was presented with clinical clarity. The traces of cyanide discovered within the apricot tarts, the accelerant that had been used to mask the poison's characteristics, the laboratory analysis confirming that the glaze on the tarts had been deliberately compromised to hasten their cooling and thus accelerate the poison's absorption. Witnesses were called to testify regarding Eleanor's behavior in the days preceding the murder, her unusual interest in Mr. Fairfax's habits and residence, her insistence upon delivering refreshments to Blackthorn Manor. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Miss Marple herself, who appeared as a witness for the prosecution with the sort of composed certainty that seemed to settle the matter before the defense could even mount its objections. She described her observations at the summer fete, her subsequent investigations, her conclusions regarding the mechanics of the poisoning. The defense attorney attempted to portray her as an amateur meddler whose interpretations might be colored by imagination rather than evidence, but Miss Marple's testimony had the peculiar quality of absolute credibility. She spoke with the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and the jury seemed to recognize in her observations a truth that transcended mere forensic detail. Eleanor's defense was mounted with considerable skill, attempting to present the crime as a moment of temporary insanity brought on by extreme emotional distress. Her attorney argued that Eleanor had been psychologically devastated by the revelation that her husband's true nature would be exposed, that in a moment of desperation she had acted without full understanding of the consequences. The defense called a psychiatrist who testified that Eleanor demonstrated signs of significant emotional disturbance, that her actions were consistent with someone experiencing a severe psychological crisis rather than premeditated murder. Yet the prosecution's counter-argument proved more compelling. The systematic nature of Eleanor's preparations, the careful acquisition of poison, the deliberate selection and preparation of the tarts as a delivery mechanism, the calculated arrangement of evidence to suggest suicide. These elements suggested not a moment of desperation, but rather a carefully considered plan executed with deliberate intent. Eleanor had not acted in the throes of passion or temporary madness. She had acted with the calculated precision that characterized everything she did, applying her organizational abilities to the commission of murder as methodically as she applied them to the arrangement of church flowers. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty. When the judge pronounced the sentence, life imprisonment, Eleanor received the announcement with the same composed resignation she had maintained throughout the trial. She did not weep or protest. She simply accepted the verdict as though it were an inevitability she had long since reconciled herself to accepting. It was only in the days following the trial that Miss Marple allowed herself to contemplate the full weight of what had transpired. Eleanor Carstairs would spend the remainder of her life incarcerated, her entire existence now confined to the rigid structures of prison routine. The careful order that had characterized her existence would now be imposed upon her from without rather than created by her own will. There was a certain ironic justice in that, Miss Marple reflected, though the irony brought her little satisfaction. The village, meanwhile, had begun the slow process of reintegration, attempting to reconcile its understanding of Eleanor with the crime she had committed. The church flowers were now arranged by a rotating group of volunteers, their efforts lacking the geometric perfection that Eleanor had achieved, but possessing a certain genuine spontaneity that perhaps suited the space better. The vicar's wife had begun to show signs of developing her own interests and opinions independent of Eleanor's influence, a process that seemed to be slowly liberating her from the anxieties that had characterized her previous existence. Colonel Ashford had paid a quiet visit to Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon, ostensibly to thank her for her investigative work, but truly, Miss Marple sensed, seeking absolution for the secrets he himself had harbored. His old relationship with Edward Fairfax, he explained, had been a matter of genuine affection and connection, not the shameful thing he had always felt compelled to treat it as. Eleanor's crime had paradoxically freed him to acknowledge aspects of his past that he had spent decades attempting to conceal. Diana Penrose had established herself more firmly within the village community, her independent nature seeming less threatening now that Eleanor's rigid social architecture had been dismantled. She had begun working with the local historical society to document village records, an occupation that seemed to suit her analytical mind and her appreciation for truth over comfortable fiction. And yet, beneath these surface adjustments, Little Brackham seemed fundamentally altered. The assumption of safety, the belief that secrets could be maintained indefinitely beneath the surface of respectability, had been shattered. The village had glimpsed the darkness that could lurk beneath carefully maintained order, and it had been permanently changed by that glimpse. 6 months after Eleanor Carstairs' conviction, Little Brackham had settled into a new equilibrium, one that acknowledged the disruption that had occurred, but attempted to rebuild around it with the resilience of small communities everywhere. The village had survived scandal before. The vicar's wife's nervous breakdown in 1952, the school teacher's illicit romance in 1968. And it would survive this as well, though perhaps with a deeper wariness about the assumptions it made regarding its own inhabitants. It was on a mild April afternoon that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, a solicitor from the county town, a young man of perhaps 45 who introduced himself as the executor of Edward Fairfax's estate. He carried with him a leather portfolio containing documents and, more significantly, sealed envelope bearing Miss Marple's name in handwriting that she recognized immediately as Edward's own. Mr. Fairfax wrote this letter some weeks before his death, the solicitor explained, settling himself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the careful courtesy of someone trained in the delicate matters that accompanied inheritance and posthumous revelations. He left instructions that it was to be delivered to you in the event of his death, regardless of the circumstances. He seemed to anticipate, I think, that you might become involved in whatever transpired. Miss Marple accepted the envelope with steady hands, though her mind was already engaged in the process of attempting to understand what Edward might have wished to communicate to her. She opened the letter with deliberate care, revealing several pages of closely written text that seemed to represent a confession of sorts, though one written with the peculiar perspective of someone contemplating his own potential demise. The letter explained in considerable detail Edward's relationship with Reverend Carstairs, the passionate connection that had sustained both men for several years before social pressure and self-denial had forced its conclusion. Edward wrote of his decision to settle in Little Brackham not with any intention of exposing the past, but rather with a hope that proximity to the place where his greatest love had been experienced might allow him some degree of closure or reconciliation with himself. He had not come to destroy Eleanor's carefully maintained illusions, but rather to find some manner of peace with his own choices and losses. Yet Edward's letter also revealed something that the trial had never quite addressed: his growing awareness that Eleanor was aware of his past, and his increasingly anxious attempts to communicate to her that he harbored no intention of publicly documenting or exposing what had transpired between himself and her husband. He had been attempting, in his final weeks, to convince Eleanor that she had nothing to fear from his presence, that his desire for authenticity did not extend to betraying confidences or destroying reputations. The final paragraph of the letter contained a passage that struck Miss Marple with particular force. "If I am dead when you read this, Miss Marple, then Eleanor has likely taken the matter into her own hands, fearing exposure even though no exposure was forthcoming. Please understand that I do not blame her. Fear is a terrible thing, and the fear of exposure, of being seen for what one truly is, can drive even good people to terrible acts. I only wish I had found the words to reassure her that some secrets, once they lose their power to destroy us, become merely sad facts of history rather than instruments of shame." After the solicitor's departure, Miss Marple sat for a considerable time with the letter in her lap, contemplating the tragedy of miscommunication that had led to murder. Eleanor and Edward had been locked in a dance of mutual fear, Eleanor terrified of exposure, Edward attempting desperately to communicate that no exposure was intended. Their failure to adequately communicate across the gulf of their different fears had resulted in death and incarceration, an outcome that seemed particularly cruel given that it need not have occurred at all. That evening, Miss Marple made a decision that she had been contemplating for some weeks. She composed a letter to Eleanor Carstairs to be delivered through the prison authorities, in which she enclosed portions of Edward's letter, specifically those passages in which he had attempted to communicate his peaceful intentions toward the secret of her husband's past life. She wrote to Eleanor with the careful precision that characterized all her communications. "I thought you should know that Mr. Fairfax harbored no intention of exposing your husband's secrets. His desire for authenticity extended to his own life, not to the violation of other people's privacy. Your greatest fear was never going to be realized, which makes the tragedy of what transpired all the more profound. I'm not writing this to diminish your culpability or to suggest that your crime was somehow justified. Rather, I am writing because I believe you deserve to know that the act you committed was based upon a misunderstanding, a terrible, tragic misunderstanding that might have been prevented had you simply asked Mr. Fairfax what his true intentions were." Whether Eleanor ever truly comprehended the full weight of this realization, Miss Marple would never know. But she sent the letter nonetheless, believing that even in incarceration, even in the face of irreversible consequences, there was value in understanding the true nature of one's errors. The solicitor informed her, during a subsequent visit, that Edward's estate had been substantial, considerable enough that he had left a generous bequest to the village church, to be used for whatever charitable purposes the new vicar deemed appropriate. There was also a smaller bequest to Diana Penrose, with a note indicating that he had valued her honesty and her refusal to participate in convenient fictions. And there was, finally, a small sum left to Miss Marple herself, not for charity or good works, but for her personal use, in recognition, as Edward's will stated, of a woman who sees truly in a world built upon comfortable illusions. Summer had returned to Little Brackham, bringing with it the sort of gentle warmth that seemed to soften the harder edges of the preceding months. The village had continued in its process of gradual normalization, though the murder of Edward Fairfax and the conviction of Eleanor Carstairs had left permanent alterations in the social landscape. Where once there had been an unspoken agreement to maintain pleasant fictions, there now existed a certain wariness, a recognition that appearances could be profoundly deceiving. It was during this summer that Miss Marple found herself reflecting more deliberately than she had in some time upon the nature of justice, morality, and the curious intersection between what the law demanded and what truth required. She had solved the mystery of Edward Fairfax's death with the precision and clarity that characterized all her investigative work. Eleanor Carstairs was serving a life sentence for her crime. The legal machinery had functioned precisely as it was designed to function, and yet Miss Marple could not entirely escape the sense that something remained unresolved, some aspect of the affair that the courts and the law had necessarily left untouched. It was this contemplation that prompted her to accept an invitation to tea from the new vicar and his wife, a younger couple than their predecessors, more inclined toward progressive thinking and less invested in the maintenance of traditional village hierarchies. The vicarage had been redecorated in their brief tenure, the heavy Victorian furnishings replaced by lighter, more contemporary pieces that suggested a household more comfortable with change than the previous occupant had been. "We wanted to discuss the church's charitable endeavors," the vicar explained as they settled in his study. "Mr. Fairfax's bequest has given us considerable resources to address various community needs. We wondered whether you might have thoughts regarding how those resources might be most effectively deployed." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I think," she said slowly, "that Mr. Fairfax would have appreciated contributions toward the mental health services in our county." Eleanor Carstairs, whatever her crime, was also a person suffering from considerable psychological distress. Had she possessed access to proper counseling or therapeutic intervention, her tragedy might have been prevented. The vicar's wife nodded thoughtfully. "That's a very generous interpretation of someone who attempted to murder in your presence, Miss Marple." "I'm not being generous," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I'm being realistic. Eleanor Carstairs was a deeply troubled woman living in a community that neither recognized nor addressed her psychological needs. We saw only her competence, her organization, her apparent confidence. We did not see her terror, her desperation, her profound need for external validation of her worth. Had we been more perceptive, had the village been less committed to maintaining pleasant illusions, we might have recognized her suffering before it transformed into violence." This observation seemed to settle into the room with the weight of uncomfortable truth. The vicar and his wife exchanged glances that suggested they understood, perhaps for the first time, the degree to which Eleanor's crime had represented not merely individual pathology, but also communal failure. That same week, Miss Marple received a visitor who was unexpected, though not entirely surprising. Sergeant Willis now, promoted to the rank of inspector and assigned to a broader region that included Little Brackham but extended well beyond it. He had come, ostensibly, to inform her of a commendation that the police service intended to award for her investigative assistance. In reality, Miss Marple sensed he had come to process certain aspects of the case that continued to trouble him. "I've been reviewing the entire file," Willis explained, settling into the familiar chair that seemed to have become his regular seat in Miss Marple's sitting room. "I keep wondering whether we missed something, whether there was some intervention point where the tragedy might have been prevented." "Of course there were intervention points," Miss Marple said without hesitation. Eleanor might have confided her fears to the vicar or to the doctor or to any one of several people in the village who might have provided her with reassurance and perspective. Edward might have made his peaceful intentions clearer to Eleanor had he understood the depth of her anxiety. I myself might have recognized Eleanor's distress earlier and taken steps to address it. The tragedy was not inevitable, Inspector. It was the result of accumulated failures of communication and empathy. But we can't blame ourselves for Eleanor's decision to commit murder, Willis protested, though his tone suggested he was arguing against his own internal conviction rather than against Miss Marple's assessment. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "Eleanor bears full responsibility for her actions. The law has rightly held her accountable, and yet we can acknowledge that the circumstances that led to those actions were, to some degree, preventable. We can recognize that a community that was more attentive to the psychological well-being of its members, more willing to acknowledge vulnerability rather than dismiss it as weakness, might have prevented this tragedy." Willis departed somewhat later, carrying with him not comfort precisely, but something perhaps more valuable: the recognition that his professional competence as a law enforcement officer need not preclude a broader understanding of the social and psychological factors that contributed to crime. He promised to implement new procedures for assessing not merely evidence of criminal activity, but also the mental health status of potentially vulnerable community members. As summer progressed toward autumn, Little Brackham seemed to settle into a new understanding of itself. The village remained picturesque, its gardens remained well-maintained, its residents continued to navigate the complex social rituals that characterized small English communities. Yet beneath this continuity there existed a new awareness, a recognition that beauty and order could coexist with darkness and chaos, that the most carefully maintained facades concealed depths that might contain either profound suffering or terrible rage. And Miss Marple, observing all of this with her characteristic quiet attention, reflected upon the particular sadness of human existence, the way that fear could transform love into violence, the way that shame could metastasize into desperate acts, the way that communities built themselves upon the foundation of maintained illusions that might collapse at any moment, revealing the complicated, struggling humanity beneath. Autumn arrived in Little Brackham with a sort of gradual transition that seemed to mirror the village's own slow evolution. The leaves turned from green to gold to brown, with the patient inevitability of seasons changing, and Miss Marple found herself spending more time in her garden, tending to the roses and dahlias that had flourished under her patient care for more decades than she cared to enumerate. It was on a particularly crisp October afternoon, as Miss Marple was pruning the last of her summer blooms, that she received a final letter from Eleanor Carstairs. The envelope bore the official prison stamp, and the handwriting within was noticeably less precise than Eleanor's previous correspondence. The product, Miss Marple surmised, of hands that had begun to lose their steadiness, perhaps from age or from the psychological weight of incarceration. Eleanor wrote of her acceptance of her sentence, of her gradual understanding of the irony that had characterized her crime. She wrote of having begun volunteer work in the prison library, where she had discovered unexpected solace in organizing books and facilitating access to literature for women who had even fewer resources than she possessed. Most significantly, she wrote of having finally comprehended the profound lesson that Miss Marple's investigation had inadvertently taught her, that order and control, pursued with such absolute dedication, could become instruments of their own destruction. I have spent my life believing that if I could only arrange everything perfectly, if I could only maintain complete control over my circumstances and my reputation, then I would be safe, Eleanor wrote. I now understand that this was a profound illusion. The very rigidity that I cultivated became the framework within which I imprisoned myself. When Edward Fairfax appeared to threaten that carefully maintained order, I reacted not with reason, but with desperation, because I had never developed any capacity for flexibility, for adaptation, for accepting that some things could not be controlled. The letter concluded with a request that Miss Marple might, if she was willing, visit Eleanor in prison. Eleanor did not expect forgiveness. She understood that her crime had forfeited any claim to such grace. She merely wished to speak with someone who had understood her actions with such clarity to comprehend more fully the nature of her own pathology, to perhaps find some manner of meaning in the tragedy she had created. Miss Marple considered this request for several days before deciding to honor it. She made the journey to the women's prison some 30 miles distant, traveling by bus with the careful deliberation of someone for whom such undertakings required significant physical preparation. The prison was a modern facility, considerably less forbidding than Miss Marple had anticipated, though the security procedures and the atmosphere of confinement were nonetheless profound reminders of the permanent consequences of Eleanor's actions. Eleanor, when she appeared in the visiting room, had aged considerably in the months since her incarceration. Her hair had gone entirely grey, and she wore it now in a simple braid rather than the geometric arrangements that had once characterized her appearance. Yet her eyes retained their intelligence, and when she spoke, her voice carried the peculiar quality of someone who had undergone profound transformation through suffering. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said simply, settling herself across from Miss Marple at the designated visiting table. "I wasn't certain you would." "I came," Miss Marple replied, "because I believe that understanding is important, even when, or perhaps especially when, it cannot change the fundamental facts of what has occurred. You committed a terrible crime, Eleanor. That cannot be undone. But understanding the circumstances that led to that crime, comprehending the nature of human desperation, these things have value beyond mere legal procedure." They spoke for the better part of 2 hours, a conversation that moved through various territories: Eleanor's childhood, her marriage, her years of maintaining the fiction of her husband's goodness, her gradual deterioration into the psychological state that had made murder seem like a rational response to threatening circumstances. Miss Marple listened with the careful attention that had characterized her throughout her life, offering neither judgment nor absolution, merely the gift of genuine attention to another human being's struggle. As Miss Marple prepared to depart, Eleanor grasped her hand with surprising intensity. "I understand now," Eleanor said, "that I killed Edward Fairfax, not merely because I feared exposure, but because I could not tolerate the idea of relinquishing control, of accepting that my carefully maintained world might contain elements I could not manage. In a strange way, my crime was not fundamentally about protecting my husband's reputation. It was about my desperate attempt to maintain the illusion that I could control reality through sufficient effort and organization." Miss Marple returned to Little Brackham that evening, exhausted but also strangely fulfilled. She had accomplished what the law had required of her: the identification and exposure of a murderer, the delivery of justice through the legal system. Yet she had also accomplished something that the law could not address: the achievement of understanding, the recognition of shared human vulnerability, the acknowledgement that even the most heinous acts emerged from comprehensible motivations and understandable fears. The village had, by now, largely moved beyond the scandal that had disrupted it. Edward Fairfax's memorial plaque had been installed in the church, commemorating his generous bequest to the community. Eleanor's house had been sold to a young family who had no knowledge of its previous occupant's crime. The summer fete had resumed its annual occurrence, and the village gardens continued to flourish under the ministrations of various hands, each bringing their own aesthetic preferences to the work of cultivation. Yet Miss Marple knew, as she settled back into her cottage in the gathering darkness of October evening, that Little Brackham had been fundamentally altered by what had transpired. The assumption of safety, the belief that careful observation of social conventions could prevent tragedy, had been shattered. The village had glimpsed the darkness that could lurk beneath order and respectability, and it would never quite recover the innocent faith in appearances that it had possessed before. She poured herself a small glass of sherry and settled into her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet room. Outside, the autumn wind scattered the remaining leaves, each one a reminder that even the most carefully maintained order ultimately yielded to the inexorable processes of change and decay. And Miss Marple, the village's quiet observer, continued her patient observation of human nature, that most complex and most comprehensible of mysteries.